meditation, altering states of consciousness, breath work, and all kinds of stuff like that that really have these profound, phenomenal, measurable impacts on our brain. And also those impacts on our brain are actually having real life implications. So for improving mental health, focus, clarity, joy, happiness, compassion, satisfaction with life.
Hello, everyone. We are live on Facebook, 41 minutes late. Sorry about that. First time, had some technical difficulties. I am Holly Copeland. I own a coaching business called HeartMind Alchemy. This is live streaming to HeartMind Alchemy Project. This is a page I started with Stephen Altair-Shyam, and to be a place for people to come together and discuss consciousness, brainwaves, neuroscience, meditation, and explore that whole realm together. Normally, I'm going to be posting this to my own personal business, HeartMind Alchemy website, Facebook page, but we're with the help of a friend, Stephen's letting us post here. So for today, it's going to be here, and I'll share it on my page. Who am I? I own HeartMind Alchemy, and I'm also a human potential coach. And I am a research scientist, and I guess meditation enthusiast and brainwave geek, probably sums it up, consciousness explorer. And I am really excited to, do this regular Facebook Live, to bring people on to have conversations about these types of issues together and explore them every week. And sometimes maybe it'll just be me. But this week, I'm really excited that HeartMind Alchemy Project member, Neuroscientist Kiefer O'Sullivan is here. And we are going to talk about a meditation that I did and a brainwave analysis that he did. So I'm super excited to have him. Welcome, Kiefer.
Oh, thank you, Holly. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm psyched to talk about some brain science today. You had a pretty cool graph, so I think it's going to be pretty informative and interesting for people to listen in and see what's going on.
I can't wait to dive in and talk about all the gory details about this graph, which I will share and put up in just a minute. But why don't you take a minute to just tell people who you are?
Sure. So my name, Jordan Kiefer O'Sullivan. I'm a neuroscientist. And so a lot of my history has been in kind of molecular biology, pathology, especially relating to neuroscience. But in the past 3 to 4 years, I've been really, really diving deep into this EEG science, into this, this wealth of knowledge that there is with this meditation, altering states of consciousness, breath work, and all kinds of stuff like that that really have these profound, phenomenal, measurable impacts on our brain. And also those impacts on our brain are actually having real life implications. So for improving mental health, focus, clarity, joy, happiness, compassion, satisfaction with life, stuff like that. A lot of these things are super, super key for, one, just understanding who we are as, humans, but also solving a lot of the intense stress, burnout, anxiety, things that are really, really becoming almost epidemic in our society. And so meditation, EEG science, breath work, stuff like that is really phenomenal at being able to access our own brains non-invasively, which is key as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. And you've spent the last couple of years working with people on various aspects of brain health, right?
Yeah. So I've kind of been on 2 different aspects of it. One, doing that research, so doing the the stats and the analysis, the brain mapping and that type of thing. But then also being like a brain health coach, being like a meditative brain health coach, to be able to guide people through that process, to be able to kind of, sit down and say, hey, this isn't some weird stuff. This isn't like we're going to go, on the beach or smoke a joint on the beach. I've had people like tell me that several times, like, oh, is this some hippie stuff you're about to teach me? And, meditation, this and that. But really, no, it's evidence-based. It's something that's really phenomenal, again, at accessing your own, neural infrastructure, and in such a fashion, it is very, very effective at, being able to modulate the parts of our brains and work with the parts of our brains that are often causing, anxiety, stressful recurring thoughts, stuff like that. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. So valuable. Yeah, we want to share that really excitement to work with people around brain health coaching. And so we should probably tell people that you and I met. We took the Raising Our Vibration course together that Kevin Schillinger and Stephen Alter-Shayam led, and we did that last year, and continue to work together and explore together in that capacity.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun, and continues to be.
Absolutely.
Fun and insightful. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, so are you ready to dive in and look at this brainwave graph?
Yeah, sure. So I guess let me give people a little elevator speech on kind of what it is they're kind of about to see. Because I know most people are probably pretty used to kind of what Mind Monitor shows and stuff like that. So kind of what I do is actually taking the Muse signal, so like the raw Muse signal, and basically porting that into kind of what I'm more familiar with using, which is like that kind of more professional EEG analysis software. And so being able to look into that signal and see with much greater finesse and detail, okay, what specific frequencies are here? What power are these frequencies at? Somewhat where are these frequencies coming from? And, from that, it really gives you the next level of analytical capabilities and interpretive abilities for people who are, very much deep into this meditation, tracking progress type of thing, to be able to say, oh, I have a dominant alpha state, but what does that mean exactly in more detail? Alpha could be anywhere between 8 and 12 hertz. And where it sits on that spectrum is, different forms of alpha with different sources and stuff like that. And so kind of what I'm doing is being able to look into the greater, finer details of those graphs to be able to make more powerful commentary, I suppose you could say.
Great. And I think especially for this HeartMind Alchemy project community, that will be of great interest, because there's a lot of people on this community in particular that do record their brainwaves with Muse. And, we use Mind Monitor, which is a fantastic tool. And more recently, we're able to look at frontal and temporal sensors, which is, we've all been sort of geeking out on that the past week. But some of the data that you're able to, show us that we don't have access to, I think will be really insightful. So
absolutely, yeah.
So let me take a minute to just explain to folks. I recorded a 40-minute meditation or 45-minute meditation last week. I did this in the evening. I did this with my eyes closed in a dark room. This is my closet where I meditate. For those who know me, my cave. And I also wear earplugs now when I meditate, because I'm doing a lot of work on hearing inner sounds. And so this was a self-guided meditation. The beginning of it, I did kind of a Kriya breathing style breathing up my spine. And then the rest of it was this sort of focused attention on inner sound and spacious awareness, kind of a combination of that, building prana. So I wasn't listening to anything. That's the setting. And I put it on the constant recording setting for Muse. So that's an option. Typically we record every second, but this is much more data than that. So this is a huge file.
And I'll say that is a very key point for me as well in my analytical process. There's a setting, if you're using Mind Monitor, where you can set it, just as you said, to be constantly recording as opposed to the 1 second interval. That gives me a much higher resolution and dense data set to actually hone in on what's there and less on inferring what's there. And so that's a really key analytical point as well.
Okay, great. So I am going to share my screen. And it's this one. And I'm just going to start by letting people see the regular Muse graph. Of course, I don't have the right one. I wanted the all bands one. Let me bring up the all bands. There we go. So there is the all bands recording of this meditation. So you can see what the familiar mind monitor recording looks like. I would say so that, the high delta here is kind of typical for me of when I'm doing the Kriya breathing, because I'm not, I'm moving a little bit, bringing energy up. And then, that we've got sort of, I very typically have this sort of high, we call it the alpha umbrella line there. And then theta underneath that, delta underneath that. And then we've got the beta gamma waves. That's pretty typical for me, where theta and alpha, theta and delta track pretty closely often. And then beta and gamma sort of are doing their own thing. This meditation, I would say it was fairly, I didn't have any big gamma spikes or dropping in until the end. And you can see at like 10:20, it was like I really kind of got into this focus space, what I call like where it feels like there's a tractor beam pulling me up, and I'm just like locked into this meditation and absorbed in the sound. And that happened at about 10:20. Until then, I was just kind of in this very calm happiness, just sort of observing.
And for my own personal curiosity, when you say kind of that tractor beam pulling upwards, is that kind of crown or maybe space above the crown, or is there a specific source from which you are being pulled?
I mean, it feels like it's actually like pulling my whole spine up, like somebody had a, like I was Pinocchio on a string, and I'm just like being kind of pulled up. But yeah, I mean, kind of, it does pull up from the crown, yeah.
Very nice, very nice.
Yeah. And very, just extremely absorbed, I would say. Like really timeless, oneless feeling, timeless, one feeling of oneness, not one less, oneness.
Another curious question as well is, as you mentioned that, what was did you have a personal perception on like how long this meditation took? That's a very interesting thing that I've started to ask people, because time is we had this idea that it's a physical constant, but it's very much a perception. And then I found very much when I'm guiding people into these meditative states and stuff like that, that temporal regulation of how long something takes kind of gets a little fluid, and it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I would say lately, as I've been more absorbed in meditations and more absorbed in the sound, time feels compressed. I'm much less aware of time overall. And definitely when I drop in, like at 10:20, then it really feels, it's very compressed feeling, or it's compressed away. It just, I'm not really aware of time. It drops away.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I noticed that.
Yeah. So, so that's that one. I wonder, do you want to just I'll quickly show you the frontal for perspective. Here's the frontal graph. It's a little, I'm still sort of sorting out the differences in the frontal versus the temporal.
Yeah, the frontal is going to be much more sensitive to the delta, and that's where I would expect to see that, just because the eyes, the two frontal sensors, those ones in particular that Muse has are those are the closest ones on a typical EEG layout that are closest to the eyes, and so those are the ones that pick up any eye movement, and so those are also the ones when you have much bigger analytical setups, so more electrodes, that you can basically use the frontal electrodes as a way to judge if something is ocular activity or eye activity or not. And so that would be I haven't looked too much into the too many of the mind monitor dividing up between the frontal and the temporal, but I would almost suspect a lot more delta trending in the frontal, and then probably a lot more alpha trending in the temporal.
In the temporal. And I think you see that here. Let me show you the temporal. Google, taking a little while. Oh, this is an exercise in patience today.
Yeah. Chugging all of those kilobytes of data. Oh, there we go.
I know. It's like a simple graph, right? Yeah. I would say that I'm just going to comment that my observation right now on the frontal and temporal is that if I was to pick a graph that described my felt state, I would pick the temporal.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
For whatever that's worth. I don't know.
Yeah, and it might be a thing where that is just where a lot more activity is happening for you. In my opinion, it's probably a mix between frontal and then temporal, and then the temporal sensors will also pick up some of that parietal occipital activity as well.
All right, should we jump to let's jump to the interesting stuff, which is your data.
Yeah, so we can look at the power spectrum density of this stuff. And so
okay, so which one do you want to start with?
So let's do that one next, but let's do the overall just to give people, so there's, yeah, you can see from some 0 hertz to 128 actually is the upper limit there. That's the highest I can look with Muse. And so just to give people an idea of what these axes mean and stuff like that, it's always the first thing when you're looking at scientific graphs. Look at the axes. This is not a mind monitor graph, and so it's not similar to that. You'll see along the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis on the bottom, it has the frequency. So your delta is going to be very close to that bottom left corner, and then you can see the different markers and stuff like that. So most of the activity in the brain in meditation is typically that sub 20 hertz, and so that's why we see that that bulk of activity. And then many studies you'll notice as well, they may cut off their analysis at 30 or 60 hertz depending upon what exactly they're looking at, because that little area where all the activity is really historically the sweet spot where a lot is happening. And then more in modern times, in the past 5-10 years, we're finding this gamma thing is really crucial, important, and integral to the whole process, especially when you consider people that have been training in meditation over a number of years. The gamma becomes more and more relevant and more interesting as well. And so from that perspective, some of the other graphs I do, I zoom in on that more active zone, but it's always good to start with look at the whole thing, kind of see where we're at and stuff like that. So to go over a few of the peaks, I won't go in chronological order. I'll go in the order of least interesting to most interesting. Okay. So the couple that people will see is the 2 peaks, one right before 60 and one right before 120 hertz. And so you're seeing those most prominently in the TP10, that's the orange line, which is, so that's that right side ear sensor. The temporal sensors, we discussed, have a lot of like noise. They have a lot of, they're made from a very non-traditional EEG electrode type. So they're like a conductive silicone, which seems to be very, very suspect to a lot of interference. It seems to pick up tons of stuff. And that's why you'll notice that on this graph, there's every electrode is shown, but the power from the temporal electrodes are much higher. The frontal electrodes are represented on this graph, but since the temporal electrodes just have that big black sound wave of activity that's kind of blowing things out, it makes them a lot smaller. And so that's in one of the fewer graphs, and one of the next graphs we'll actually zoom in and see that there's a lot of good frontal activity. But yeah, so the 60 and the 120, Those, for those of us in the US, are our classic kind of power line frequency interference. In the United States, so power lines and electronics and like the mains in your house and stuff like that electrically operate at a 60 hertz frequency. And then you kind of see the harmonics of that going upward on an EEG graph. So a 60, 120, 180, those will tend to get picked up, again, depending upon the room that somebody's in, how close they are to power lines, how susceptible the EEG headset they're using is to interference. And so those are 2 points that are pretty classic power line frequencies. The other one that people will notice that's in between is that 80 hertz bump. And this one is a little bit of a phantom right now, to where, you know, I wish I could definitively say, this is what it is, here's where it comes from. But because there are a couple options of what this could be. On the more mundane level, 80 hertz can be a spectrum to where if there was a lot of, let's say, tension in the neck or maybe the back of the skull, in that kind of region where some people can just carry a lot of kind of weight and tension, especially if you're punching over or meditating, stuff like that. That tends to come in around that 80 hertz as well. The other aspect is that is also a frequency where we do see some of the gamma activity that's resulting from meditative practice, specifically in the focused attention, you know, the energetic, subtle energy meditations, Kriya yoga, things where people are focusing on, you know, energy meridians or focusing on something in their body and moving it around and stuff like that. And so for me as a neuroscientist, the answer to solve that question is I need more electrodes, basically. You know, that's the kind of thing to be able to assess out, okay, with multiple electrodes, you can start to very much localize more specifically where something is coming from. And you can say that, oh, it definitely comes from this area, or it's actually showing, you know, it's actually stronger, you know, in the crown region than it is coming from the neck region. And so you can start to do some math and infer the spatial locations and begin to infer, oh, is this a muscular thing? Is this a, you know, an energetic meditation thing? And the answer typically is that it's a mix of both. You know, EEG picks up a lot of signals and stuff like that. And so there's always a lot to separate out and stuff like that. And so those are the interesting kind of back end, you know, gamma things. And in addition as well, you know, the power line frequency could very well include, you know, gamma activity in its own right, to where if there was something that in your brain was happening at 60 hertz, that would be reinforced by the power line frequency, but then it would be very hard to, in a very limited electrode setup, to say, oh, how much of this is power line, how much of this is that. And there's a lot of different filters and stuff you can work with, and it becomes a little bit time consuming to work with that.
So like my graph didn't have a big gamma spike, but it did have that one kind of rise at the end. And so what I'm hearing you say is there's really nothing on this graph that we can see that. It might be buried in the 80, that little 80 spike, but it's really, there's not really a signal of that here. That's essentially what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing as well, to your point, is that, you know, this isn't a huge gamma graph anyway. I have run the similar analysis on people that have had that gamma graph, and they do show some more specific activity. Sometimes that's, and I'll add specific activity that is separate from power line and known muscular bands and stuff like that. It seems to be a unique kind of thing. I also kind of see the 40 hertz sometimes around there.
Yep.
And so that's, it's pretty interesting, and it's also very individualized. I'm finding some people are the same. Some people have similar gamma bumps, but then everybody almost has their own kind of thumbprint of, this is my particular way that my brain is manifesting itself in this particular meditation.
Okay. So let's move to the more interesting, but that was really interesting to hear you talk through that for sure.
Yeah.
And
Oh yeah,
yeah,
there's so much with EEG science, and when you get into signal analysis, it's just a rabbit hole of so much stuff, so much stuff.
my life is a rabbit hole these days. Alice falling down deep rabbit hole. Okay, which
True
one
for
should we look
yeah.
at? Which one should I look at next?
That one, yeah, that one's
Yeah.
good. And so yeah, so we can talk through so a couple of the different. So I guess to start in the delta realm, and then from there we'll talk, because the really interesting stuff is that 6 hertz, 8 hertz activity.
Yeah.
That 2 to 4 hertz range, that's where a lot of your, or that 0 to 4 hertz range, that's where a lot of your blinks, eye movements, saccades and stuff like that. So, moving your eyes left and right, up and down, lots of subtle movements and things with the eyes that we often are not aware of when we meditate, but then kind of show up on the analysis later.
Okay.
And so that is what I would associate most getting pulled into that that's especially that 4 hertz peak, because it's very, very powerful.
Yeah.
Non-brain signals, that is, so like signals from cranial nerves, so the nerves around your face, the nerves in your eyes, stuff like that, they tend to be slow frequency but high power. And so that's why on a lot of spectrograms, FFTs, anything that's breaking apart the frequency analysis, there's this like bulk of power that's left shifted into the delta zone and stuff like that. A lot of scientists actually, it is a huge pickle to separate that stuff, and that's another thing to where when you have more electrodes, you can begin to assess some of that stuff out. But with Muse, since there's only the 2 frontal electrodes and the 2 temporal electrodes, there's a very limited ability to take that data and cut it out. Because when you cut out that data, you've cut out most of what the recording is, and then you don't have anything left to analyze. And so it's kind of interesting thing that, for Muse, it tends to somewhat over-report delta. It also underreports theta. But in the general in neuroscience, there's been a lot of weird studies for delta, in terms of people saying, oh, we can have it increase when we do a meditation study, then another person will replicate that study and show that it decreases. And so there's a lot of, and so in my opinion, in diving into that literature, it all depends on how are they handling these filters, these artifact rejection system, how are they handling that non-neural data can sometimes influence what they report on delta. But the truth of it is that we don't know with any definitiveness what is happening until we have until the technology that is now super expensive becomes more affordable for the average laboratory, or until we develop more sophisticated hardware that can look at these ultra low frequencies and be able to kind of go over them with a fine tooth comb and be like, oh, neural, non-neural, and be able to separate them out and see where the relationships lie. And so that's always an interesting thing. And so it's kind of funny, like many EEG setups and labs and publications will actually just ignore delta completely, because it's a time sink, and there's often not a lot of value in there unless you're doing a sleep study. For sleep studies, it's obviously of key importance, but it's extremely rare to have highly measurable amounts of active delta in the waking human brain. It's more of a deep sleep kind of thing. Delta tends to release a lot of like deep healing hormones and stuff like that. So when you're in deep sleep, you can, clean out the brain, so to speak, and do that kind of thing.
Let me ask you. Oh, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was just gonna say it's kind of TBD, to be determined, what exactly, if any, relationship there is, in that realm. But for now, we do notice a lot of the physiological signals, as I call them, which is the facial nerve, stuff like that.
Can you talk a little bit about why TP10 is the big spike versus TP9? For those who may not know, TP10 is the right side and TP9 is the left.
So that, is something that I was actually thinking about, and that I can't actually definitively say why. I'm wondering if there was a slight difference in the connections between your ears, something like that. I know you're familiar with WAVI and trying to get the electrodes under the right resistance. So I'm not sure for WAVI, but there's like a green light, yellow light, red light, usually type of thing. And it has to be within a certain quality range to be able to be readable. Muse has a more binary aspect of that. It's either connected or it's not. And so if you're connected but have a high resistance, it might be picking up all kinds of weird stuff. Another theory is that potentially what is to your right physically, whether it's a wall or some electronics, or maybe to the left outside your house is nature, and the right is the rest of your house. I'm not sure, but they really should be more equivalent, and the fact that they're not is somewhat of an anomaly. I mean, and you will see in different neural practices and meditations that there can be a left side, right side dominance. But the power difference between the two here leads me to believe that there's some anomalous activity here that is causing some wacky stuff. I've actually more frequently seen the wacky electrode being the left temporal, so it was weird that yours turned out to be the right one, and so it's seems to be different.
And I have noted, because you can go into Mind Monitor and you can look at interference, or you can look at the raw signal. I have noted that in that place where when I meditate there is some kind of electrical signal on my right side. I see that kind of classic worm, look. So
yeah.
So maybe that's what we're looking at there. All right, let's get to the interesting
stuff. Actually, if you have the raw I sent you, it might be good just to show that really quick, because that's kind of would illustrate this point and really shows the difference in the raw signals. So people can really kind of see. Yeah, there we go. So along the x-axis is just time, so it's going from start to finish. So you have TP9, AF7, AF8, TP10. AF7 and AF8, you can see their raw signal. That is what I want the temporal signals to be. That's what the temporal signals should more look like. That is like, so the frontal sensors, they are probably varying around a 20 plus or minus 20 microvolt range, which is that's a pretty good, it's pretty clean, it's pretty neural data, right? It's something that I would expect. And then when it doesn't show that, that gives me cause for pause, and stuff like that. And so the fact that TP9, is showing that highly, variable activity, and then TP10 as well is like, crazy activity. That's something that we have to kind of start to kind of filter and work through and stuff like that. And another interesting point as to why this is that the frontal sensors and the temporal sensors are made from two different base components, basically. In a normal EEG, all of your electrodes are the same homogeneous type. It's usually uniform around the scalp, and it's the same exact electrodes everywhere. And they're all connected with a certain amount of resistance and so on and so forth. The frontal sensors on Muse, I believe, are I think they're silver chloride, something like that, which is much more typical for EEG, silver and gold, stuff like that. The temporal sensors for Muse are made with a form of conductive silicone. And so when I first started doing Muse stuff, I actually pulled the Muse out of the box, and I was like, oh, wait, where are the temporal sensors? I didn't know. And then I was like, oh, I looked at the spec sheet, and it's like, oh, these little gummy bands on the ears are actually conductive. And it is from there that the temporal signals are derived. The issue with that is is that when you have one set of electrodes that is made up of one thing, that has its own electronic characteristics, its own physical characteristics, its own resistance levels, its own conductivity levels, how it deals with ions, moisture, stuff like that is different. And then when you have something else that is conductive silicone, which I don't know a ton about because I've never actually seen any other headsets besides Muse with, it's not like comparing apples and oranges, but it's like oranges and some weird blood oranges or something like that. There's a difference, that's, they're both reading brain data, but the characteristics that each of them have can sometimes give this almost like philosophical, analytical cause for pause, where you're like, okay, are they really equivalent when one is made from one thing and collects electrical activity in such a fashion, and one is, an alternate version of that? And so that's another, kind of taking analysis with a grain of salt, and also some of the merits of being able to analyze this stuff with more depth, is being able to recognize and then work around those issues to get to the real stuff. But it was always interesting to see that those temporal sensors are almost always just picking up whatever's around, basically.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is we really have to factor that in to the overall understanding of what happened in that meditation.
Right, exactly. And then comparing that as well to temporal electrodes from other studies that were not conductive silicone, stuff like that. And so it's always just another factor to consider, another variable, another cause for interest and stuff like that.
All right, let's get on to, we want to go back to, let's see, back to that one for a minute.
Yeah, this is a good
one. Okay.
Yeah, and so the two really interesting things, a couple of different things happening here. One is a 6 hertz peak, one is an 8 hertz, and then another is that kind of slight rumbling that we're getting around the kind of 14 to about 18 hertz level, maybe like 13 to 18 hertz kind of stuff. So speaking, I guess, in chronological order, the 6 hertz theta, this is a really, really interesting one, as it correlates with what I'm increasingly seeing in mystical meditations. It's this very frontal derived theta. There's a really good study, and we reference it a lot in the HeartMind group, with the Carmelite nuns and their practice. And so they actually see this similar activity, right in that frontal, almost like that third eye area, if you were to kind of put it there, right behind your forehead. And they exhibit this marked increase in theta, typically when they are, it's like the perception was like unification or union with God, basically, was their description, and mysticism and stuff like that. And so it raises some interesting interpretive questions to where, what is the frontal lobe's role in this perception of the mystical, the supernatural, or the divine, and stuff like that? So typically that frontal theta is often a sign of an expanding cognitive load and an increase in almost trying to memorize something. So it's almost like something lofty in your brain, right? And you're trying to perceive it in a way. You're holding it in your mind, basically. Like there's something that you have internalized, and your mind is engaging with it. And so, for me, I'm curious about, okay, is this frontal theta associated with their focused awareness in being able to maintain their focus on this object, or is this related to them having a capacity to remember and to generate memories of this experience, which I think is something very interesting. And again, this theta, especially the 6 hertz bump that I'm seeing with you, is something that I've seen several times now, and it's typically in more experienced meditators, where I think, and again, this is a theory that I have, when you get to a certain point, you are no longer focusing on the techniques or the breath work or the this or the that, the nuances of what you have to do for your meditation. The meditation is just happening, and then you are freed up to engage with your meditation on a much higher cognitive level. And so it's interesting as well that we're seeing more and more people, and there's discussion in the group as well about this idea of like there's almost this sensation of like downloading information, something like that, to where they feel like there's like something is happening in their brain, they're getting something. And to me, this theta association might be that combination of the focused and trained awareness to focus on the mystical, the divine, the supernatural, or whatever it is for you, and to also engage with that cognitively to remember what it is, remember the feelings, the perceptions. Some people get inspiration, ideas, stuff like that. And this to me could be a sign of an increased cognitive capacity to engage with the meditation on a much higher level, which to me is very, very interesting.
That is so interesting. Pat, you're just a wealth of knowledge. I love hearing your thoughts and theories. One clarifying question. So when I look at this graph, I see TP10 and TP9 having these theta bumps. You were talking about frontal theta.
Yeah, so go back to because it'll show up on both basically, and that's something to where with the limited electrode set, both readings will almost show on each electrode. Okay. But I think the noise and the power and the things that are happening with that temporal electrode are perhaps blowing out that signal a lot more and just making it they're amplifying it in a way that it should not be amplified.
Yeah, it's possible. I also will add in, I did have that full 19-channel EEG with WAVI, and that TP6 site, which is close to the TP10 site, I have this like unusual high Z-score at that one location, which is sort of really interesting. So I have this other reference point on theta and alpha both.
So yeah, it absolutely could be that, because again, kind of going back to the Carmelite nuns, I don't have the study in front of me, but I think their most significant activity was frontal, but then it also leads back and becomes coherent with somewhat parietal central electrodes as well. And so it kind of links back to actually right kind of where you're talking about that temporal parietal area. You said like T6, which would be like, imagine T10, but kind of closer up to the crown a little bit.
Yeah.
So higher up.
That was my memory too on that study, that they do talk about the connections between the two.
That increased synchrony and coherence, and so I bet there is some crosstalk there. And again, the temporal aspect of meditation is an interesting one, as the temporal region in general is a very it's the region where our brain seems almost it's where our brain processes things like religion, spirituality, experiences of the divine, experiencing unification with God or consciousness, universe, stuff like that. There's even cases of people that have like temporal lobe seizures that actually originate from those, and they actually have like overwhelming tapping into the beyond type experiences, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, and that fits too with this conversation we've been having recently on one of the threads about focused attention in the medulla as being really important aspect of where to place your attention. That you should be looking at the third eye from the medulla and focusing your attention there. And I've been in my own meditations the last couple days, actually, as a result of that conversation, paying more attention to that. And yeah, I think I noticed the difference actually. And I mean, I feel really strong feelings from that whole back of your head medulla region.
Fascinating. Yeah. And I was just commenting on that today to where right above that region that we're discussing,
Mm-hmm.
brainstem, stuff like that, that's actually where your pineal gland sits. Pineal gland has all kinds of
Yeah,
association with being the physiological third eye, right, and stuff like that.
right. Yeah,
Um,
we could have a whole hour-long discussion
yeah,
about
yeah,
that one topic.
that's super interesting. Where people go, oh, the medulla. Actually, probably the pineal gland is what people are tapping into. So that's an
Wow.
interesting thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So is there another graph? There was a third graph.
Yeah,
Is
there
it
was the
worth
third,
bringing
that
up?
the frontal, and so yeah, the frontal, again shows that, again, much more of that delta kind of below a little
Mm-hmm.
bit, and then, but it does show that the frontal
6 and
is
8.
registering that 6, 8, and then the
Yep.
roughly 13 to
Yep.
18 or so hertz range as well.
Oh, I was going to ask you before we leave it, the other one, oh, bollocks. Uh, the other one that we were looking at, I was going to ask you about the 12 to 18 hertz bump that was there that you were going to mention.
Yeah, yeah. And so this is interesting to me as well. So that range, that's like a very low beta range. And so that is like it's like a problem solving, decision making, almost like a little bit of that executive function type of thing. And that was another aspect that interests me in terms of this idea of being able to engage cognitively with the meditation more once you're experienced with it. And
Mm-hmm.
because I know a lot of people meditate and often have like resolution of problems, or they feel like something has been solved, whether they were conscious of it or not, or an issue has been unraveled or released,
Mm-hmm.
or something to that extent. And so that range can be a range that is somewhat typical, that 13 to 18, that low beta of, oh, I'm making a decision, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not so active minded that I'm
Right.
straying into very active, focused, even anxious type. It's not in that realm at all. It's more in the, I am making a decision, or some decision has been made, or I am applying some resources to solving a problem. And so that
Yeah.
can be one very common interpretation of the beta that's within that range. So that was interesting to me as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's that SMR 12 to 16 is the classic SMR range,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, which is one of the regions that we train for in, Mind Lift. And I work with some clients on Mind Lift. And that, I think of that as being that kind of mental clarity, as you say, decision making and clarity around decisions.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
absolutely.
so interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
And so I guess kind of moving on from that, the
yeah.
really interesting one for me is that 8 hertz, which is what I would define as your peak alpha frequency for that section. Um, and it's particularly interesting because it's I don't say quite low, it's nicely low, I guess. It's meditatively trained in a way that it is low in a fashion. And so that lower alpha range, um, to me, is like this very deep cognitive zone to where you're have awareness, but it's a very deeply held kind of still awareness and stuff like that. Peak alpha frequency is becoming like more and more a common metric for like cognitive performance, or being able to have a single number for where is a person's state of mind at. And so that's where this, and how can we measure that quickly and easily? And peak alpha frequency is one of those things. The typical peak alpha frequency for the average adult is around 10 to 11 hertz.
Mm-hmm.
And that is typically associated with this almost state of like readiness to receive information. Like you're sitting there and you're almost like ready to listen, but you're you're not listening yet, but you're ready to kind of kick into gear. And so when many people tap into that alpha state in their meditation, that is often that flow state that they're kind of tapping into. In meditators, that seems to get trained downwards into this increasingly lower frequency that seems to be associated with, there's papers that have been coming out that seem to associate that more with this kind of thalamocortical circuit. So the thalamocortical, basically going from the upper part of your brain to the thalamus. The thalamus integrates tons and tons of information from all over brain and your body and stuff like that. But one of the biggest things it does is integrate sensory information. And so one of the interpretations I have for increasingly seeing these people train their alpha to these low degrees is being able to zone in on that meditative area where the sensory signals that are coming from, the outside are not distracting you as much. You can hold an attentional focus at the signals that are coming in of the sights, the sounds, the everything else that's kind of coming through is like, okay, we don't need to be as receptive to that. And so that's one interpretation, at least, until more and more literature defines that precise cortical thalamo network, we'll kind of see where the chips lie on that. But that's kind of where the literature is pointing right now. And it also seems to tie very nicely into what I'm seeing with these meditators and people that tend to go lower. And then, as well as that, I would almost suspect if you kept doing whatever it is you're doing to get this low alpha, that it would kind of start to maybe join with that theta band a little bit more. I was just looking at a gentleman's graph the other day who had much less alpha, but the theta was much higher than I would have suspected. And so
interesting.
if that gets brought down to that theta zone to where, it's like this ultra low alpha or high theta that is then modulating that state of consciousness and stuff like that, which is pretty interesting. The gentleman that I looked at had been meditating for like decades. So,
okay. Well, it's something to aspire to.
Yeah. I know. Who knows when that theta came about, right? It could have been after 6 months, and then he had it. Who knows?
Right. Yeah. And I want to wrap up here, but I do want to ask you one thing. So, what do you make of the fact that these peaks fall right on like 6 and 8? Not just above or just below. And I just got done listening, or I actually didn't quite finish it, but I was listening to Robert Grant on Matt Belair's podcast, and they were talking about numerology and, prime numbers and all the, amazing kind of mathematics of mathematical symmetry in the universe and some of the, really interesting things that are found around sacred geometries. And it just sort of like, why isn't that number just a little off? Why is it pegged right at 6? And why is it, like 2, 4, 6, 8? I mean, just the symmetry of that seems a little uncanny. What's the deal?
So, I wish I could give the definitive answer, but I think it's a mix of kind of what you were saying. One, there is that almost that symmetry, right? And math works out in kind of weird ways when you get down to it. The other aspect is it could lead into a lot of the analytical techniques that are applied to this data. I'm not a mathematician, so I can't get into the nitty-gritty of how things are binned in separate categories and stuff like that. But I do notice a human trend to be reductionists, right? And we want to simplify things. And so I think that inherent bias is often in the code of these filters and equations and things.
I wondered if there was some rounding going on or something.
Yeah, and so that would be the thing where I think there is that element of trying to round and collect in discrete frequency bins. And so there might be mathematical transformation that is kind of happening there. That data science
stuff. Yeah. Okay, fascinating. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. That is just really interesting. I've got hungry kids who are kind of grumbling in the background because
Oh yeah, I've got hungry animals here.
okay.
Very similar.
So maybe we should wrap it up, but
Yeah, sure.
that was really interesting, and I just very much appreciate that deep dive look in a very different way at a meditation, and I'm eager to do another one and maybe do it in a place with some less interference, and also, you know, as I progress on my own meditative path and have bigger gamma spikes, I'd be really curious what those look like.
Yeah, exactly. Getting more people's data, and it's really, that's really the crux of it, is that it's this exploration, and it's, even as a neuroscientist, I can come and I can give you these all these answers and all this evidence, but fundamentally, it's like until the decades go by and we can really fine tune this stuff and really explore with huge amount of depth. The sky's the limit on what we'll find, and we just got to keep going, and exploring. It's a phenomenal journey.
It is a phenomenal journey. It's a really fun one. This community, the community of people we've been working with, it's just been so interesting and stimulating. So
can I give myself a brief plug as well? Is that
yeah, I was actually just going to do that. I was going to say, you're offering this as a service, right, Kiefer?
Did I throw myself in there? Yeah.
Please do.
So if people are interested in kind of learning more about, some of this analytical process that I'm doing and kind of getting it done for themselves, they can check out a website that I just started, PonderBrain.com. So PONDER brain.com. And there they can, check out some info, and I'm starting to post some articles and things there for folks, and hopefully making it a good place for some good knowledge.
Excellent. And I've been to PonderBrain. It's a great website. We've already got some super articles there. So I encourage people to go check that out and check you out. And if you want to learn more about me and the work that I do, I'm at heartmindalchemy.com, and would be happy to take calls and explore what options are available. So, well, that's it for this week. For those who were able to join us, thank you so much, and look forward to another HeartMind happy hour next week. All right, signing off.
Take care.
Thanks a lot, Kiefer.
My pleasure.
Yeah.